my slides. So I just put together some thoughts I had as to trying to define this problem space. I'm definitely open to expanding or changing these, but we've had such diverse and complex discussions in the last few meetings. I just kind of wanted to try to distill things down a little bit so we could get to that problem space that Alexander has been talking about for our in-person discussions. So one of the things I kind of want to start with the basis is, and these are kind of from our OKRs, is what are our goals when we're trying to create solutions? So I think one of the things that's come up, if not in our meetings, in the email thread, so I've enjoyed the back and forth, Piper, with you and Alexander on trying to define some of these things. And so I think one of our goals is to work as a community so we can align solutions. So any solutions we come up with will basically need support / buy-in from the CDM group, the vocabulary group, and the themis group, because they will help with actually defining those convections. So basically we'll have to work with them to align these solutions. So the other things I've been thinking about, especially when we have talked about delving into some things that are very survey specific or even very psychometric specific, is that in working on a more general level, these solutions shouldn't conflict with current ways of doing things. Like, we may have to have some new things, but we don't want to be at odds with the current process for the other clinical data types. One of the other things that I think we've seen a lot is in our presentations over the last year and a half or so, is so much has been done so far on project specific levels, which is great. It gives us use cases and it gives us examples. But I think as we come up with standards or best practices, we want them to at least be at the use case level. I don't think we're going to hit something that's one solution fits all patient reported things or all EAVs, but we probably want to have things that can be used at a case level so we get above project specific. And then one of the other things I think is an interesting discussion that we haven't gotten into much is what analyses are we wanting to do within the framework? So a lot of times when we've been talking about whether we should map as facts or triplets or question answer pairs, the discussion kind of focuses on saving the information of the questionnaire, but not necessarily what's going to be done with that information within the Odyssey framework. And so what I'm kind of meaning by that is not all things that are done with surveys have to work with Odyssey. And I'll get a little bit more into that as to like how we want to define the use cases. So what things, what types of Odyssey tools do we want to use? What do we want to do within that framework? And then what types of things do we want to do with surveys that are outside, which done with other types of clinical data? Okay, so then the next bit I wanted to try to come up with is a survey definition, because we've had a lot of discussion about that in the email threads. And so this is what I hope is a relatively generic definition of a survey that I developed for the question chapter piece, which was worked on much earlier this summer before we had some of these discussions. But I think it's pretty generic. There may be things we can do to make it more generic, but I think this kind of level sets what we mean, and then we can start talking about subtypes. And I think based on the discussions we've been having, our use cases are going to be based on subtype. I don't know that we have a general survey now that we've had some of these discussions. But Piper and everybody. So how we feel about this is like a high level general survey definition with the idea we would put in subtypes under it. And I really should just reading this so we can also think about it.
Yeah. Diane, go ahead.
No, are we going to stick with only self-reported, or are we going to include clinician reported? Because some of the Even some of the validated surveys are clinician reported, even though they're talking with a participant. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was going to say, so
Perfect.
that's a good, and that was going to be one of my questions because this has come up before. So
Mhm.
thank you, Diane. So I wasn't sure if interview was enough, or because what I'm trying to focus is that it's basically from the patient in one form or another. Um, and then we get into a fuzzy area, if we're looking at a clinician filling out a survey that's strictly based on observation versus coming from the patient. Is that still a survey, or is the EAV definition broad enough? We want to put it under there. And again, part of these are not necessarily decisions we have to make today. I think I just wanted to put this out there as part of our problem space, is deciding on these definitions. Because I think if we can't agree on what we're talking about, we're going to have a hard time defining use cases that fit in under that, and then moving forward from it. So from your perspective, do interviews include
Good.
that enough?
I'm just wondering if instead of self-reported, we put patient reported, and
Okay.
does that add,
That
another
helps.
level?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of include both options.
So you would not include things where, for example, someone else is the informant. So in the psychometric assessment area, we have a lot of parent reported and patient
Mhm.
or teacher
Mm,
reported assessments.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Good
And so
point.
I know. But I'm also, I guess what I'm trying to figure out too is what things, trying to figure out how, sorry, trying to figure out how to phrase this. So are there things that are part of psychometrics that are just too specific to be under the general definition of survey? Like it needs its own
Yes,
thing.
yes. In
Yeah.
fact,
And
I
that's
would
what I'm
say,
wondering about some of those things.
yep.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've started, and I don't know, you know, at NIH, I don't know if you folks are allowed to collaborate on papers or
Hmm.
studies. Um, but this is so I would say that the terms survey, questionnaire, assessment, test, battery, checklist, symptom checklist, right? This is a really broad class of
Yeah.
things that share in common that there is sort of a structured formal instrument created to collect information, right?
Hmm.
And that's about the extent of the
That's the
commonality.
commonality. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would
We're,
include, so I include in psychometric instruments things like the BIRAD and LUNGRAD, which are the radiology classification system. When a radiologist looks at a nodule on a lung or a nodule in a breast, there is a structured form where they classify the nodule based on various dimensions. They
mhm,
assign a specific value to each of those. So it's a controlled list. And then it generates a final score, which is a qualitative score. It's something like, like with a lung nodule, 4C
mhm,
and it means it basically is a reflection of the probability that the nodule is malignant.
mhm,
So I think a first step is, and if we're talking about surveys, I think a survey is one very small subtype. When I think of a survey, and again, this is my idea. This just my
Mhm.
thought. I think as a community, we need to have consensus about what do we want to call these
Mhm.
these classes of things.
And it
So
might
when I
even,
think of
sorry, my
us,
phone is
go
going
ahead.
off. I'm just going to turn the sound off. There we go.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
So when I think of a survey, I think of a lot of what you've been talking about so far in this work group, which is a collection of standard questions, standard answers, right? It's a way of collecting a set of observations that are comparable across time and across different samples. So BIRAD is not a survey. I mean, I think of, and so I think I don't know that it makes sense to try to address all subtypes. I think,
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah, I'm like, somewhere there's a line where it diverges enough that it's something else. Like when you talk
yep,
about a BIRAD, I think of a pathology report,
yep.
as a, that kind of thing. So yeah, I definitely think we'll have some breaks where it doesn't overlap anymore. Alexander, I noticed you joined us, so we've just kind of been chugging through some thoughts I put together based on some of our last meetings to try to better define our problem space. So we're kind of talking about goals and now definitions. I know you've kind of been with the surveys and the EAVs. Based on some things Piper has said, do you think EAV covers that, or do you see it as more part of the definition that's up here? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that EAV is the most broad definition, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
like most of the things that we mentioned is modeled exactly this way. And I
Mm-hmm.
think like the general idea and like the whole cars of this discussion was exactly because of that we just like had the very same problems in the different vocabularies, and part of the data was purely survey, another part of the data was, well, everything that you mentioned with the small
Mm-hmm.
pieces here and there. But at the end
Yep.
of the day, that was really modeled this way. Sometimes you have a compass, you have the question and the answer, or you could have the variable and the value, right? And
Mm-hmm.
specifically because of that, I mentioned the cancer registries. So they usually
Right.
model like from the perspective of the CDM of the model and how we're going to handle this, that is pretty much the same question. But I
Mm-hmm.
understand that there could be different perspectives from the whatever. What exact data are you looking from standpoint? So I totally agree.
Alexander, can I ask a clarifying question? The
Yeah.
EAV model, does that refer to, so entity, attribute, value, and the entity is sort of the question or the statement. The attribute is the answer, right? Or the response to the statement. And then the value is the meaning when you combine the question and the answer, or the observation and the what's observed.
Well, I think the value is the answer, while the attribute is the sort of the linkage between them, like the semantic sort of connection between them.
Do you have a
But
picture? So like if you did question, answer, and then the meaning. So if we said, has a doctor ever told you you have cancer? And the answer is yes. And then the finding is history of cancer. Which is the EAV part of that?
oh, EEV is like the general model, how this is modeled, right? The fact that you have these pieces and you understand that you should combine these pieces together at the question and the answer that is answered at this specific question. That
Yep.
is sort of it, right? And when it comes to the variable and the value, it's a little bit different. So the context is a little bit different. So it wasn't asked as a question, but somebody has this specific variable,
Yep.
and then it was populated with a specific value, probably taken
Yep.
from the controlled list of possible values. So all that context, how these two pieces play together, is, I think, is the like the attribute, right? But altogether, there is precisely this model, right? So once we see that the data model this way, so we put it into the same bucket, and we want to have one single solution for that, even though there could be like different subclasses and different solutions for the specific problems.
Yeah,
So
and
you're
that's
thinking, so
go
even
ahead,
like
Piper.
so even like I see what you're saying. So a flow sheet measure, right? Like you look at flow sheets, and almost always flow sheets will have an observation, right? The nurse is observing color of skin or moistness of skin, right? Or depth of the wound. And then they'll enter a value. I mean, I feel like this idea of something you're observing, the observation, and then the meaning of that is, like you said, Alexander, that's across the board. That's in notes. Notes have items and responses, right? I mean, it almost seems so universal. This variable, a variable, the
Yeah,
value of the variable.
it does. It does. It does seem universal, but in fact, we don't really deal with this type of structure often, right? Well, to some extent, often, right? But most of the data in usual claims and HR is structured differently, right? And then there is a specific, well, still wide subset of whatever data collected from different sources that is structured this way. And I think from the technical perspective on what the solution is going to be, we still want to have this, whatever, like very wide definition so that the solution is like really applied to all that. But getting back to your example on the nodes, I think that you don't really get this structured this way really often, right? So usually what you get are only the values because they're sort of like extracted under this context that there is an observation. So it's like already like the data is already processed this way that you don't need to deal with that when you get it as a source data because it's already sort of like whatever transponded, or you already have these pre-coordinated things, right? So it's in some way treated that you don't really have this problem that you would have if the data is still structured the EAV data.
I think the structure is a good point. Like some like what because as much as they want to be generic enough to cover reasonable use cases under these, I think that the fact that we talk about when we look at questionnaires, and I think Piper, you also said some of these things, we're also looking at things like everybody gets the same questions, everybody has the same option of answers. So when you get into more casual clinician observation things, I think that part of it kind of goes out the window. It's not really structured, it's just them putting things in the notes. So I think something about standardized, not in the sense that the survey's necessarily been validated and is used by everybody, but standardized in the sense that everybody's getting the same thing. Is probably an important part of the definition.
Yeah. So from a note perspective, the free text notes, absolutely, the observations are recorded in a lot of EHRs, like, in our Epic instance, we have a lot of kind of they're called And they're note templates. They're called Smart Notes in Epic. And essentially they're designed a lot like a questionnaire, right? So the review of systems where they'll say eyes, and then there'll be a certain pick list of values that they could say, so you're looking at each of the each system and you're making a standard set of observations.
Yeah, and then I think we circle back to is it patient reported? Is patient reported part of the definition, as opposed to, clinical observations, but that are done in a standardized way?
Okay, so that's okay. So survey is narrowed to the patient is the respondent. It's either a questionnaire. If it's an interview, the interview essentially follows a format of a structured question. It's a scripted interview, is what you're saying, like a
Yeah.
structured or semi-structured interview. Okay.
I mean, that's what, because on one end, we want to be broad. So I'm going to hop over to the next one because maybe this will help a little bit as to some of the things we want to consider in developing use cases. So because of the differences we've already discovered among things and also trying to narrow down a general definition, I think maybe we can focus in a little bit on subtypes and looking at use cases, and then do these use cases fit in the definition? Does the definition need to be broader, or is this a use case that's, just specific to the psychometric use group or work group or another work group? So kind of based on the conversations we've had, some of the subtypes we've discussed are custom or, borrowed surveys that are heavily modified, things that have been standardized and validated but aren't necessarily psychometrics. Psychometrics, which of course is your area, Piper. And then we've discussed and seen, whoops, I want to scroll, but I shouldn't in the slides. And then we've seen in the mapping, we've also seen these different possibilities for how these are being mapped. So, FACS is one of the things we talked about early. I think FACS is probably the easiest and most aligned with how things are currently done in OMOP, in the sense that, like, your example, has a clinician ever told you you have cancer? Yes. Then your fact is basically, the observation or finding of cancer, and that's all you're trying to record is that. And then we've had the discussion about question answer pairs, so maintaining that association, and there are reasons for doing that because there's interested in looking at nulls, having meanings that associate those things together. And then the AI Ready group has been working with these triplets where we kind of have their partitioning things in a question. I think I might have summarized this a little bit, but yeah, a little bit like you have a question or condition, you have what happens, and then you have like an answer. And so they're mapping things in different tables as part of that triplet. And then, as I was talking about before, I think we also need to think about why is it we even want to get survey data into OMOP? Is it just, from some of the studies we've heard from, like All of Us and UK Biobank, they basically just wanted to be able to use the tools. So there wasn't even necessarily the goal of trying to harmonize with other studies. They just wanted to have the tools and maybe have it there at some point. Somebody else could deal with the harmonization part. Do we just want to be able to harmonize and pull across studies and then do our typical survey-based analytics, or do we want to combine with other types of clinical data, like look at questionnaire and EHR or questionnaire and claims or something, to the end of some goal? And obviously these are not mutually exclusive, but one of the things I feel cautious about when we talk about what's the word I'm looking for? We talk about all the different types of things we could potentially map for surveys. What is why do we want OMOP to do that? What are our goals for using OMOP with the survey data? And to keep that in mind, like there's some things that may not be appropriate to map because they're not tools we have in OMOP. And then a follow-up question from that can be, well, do we need survey-specific tools for some of the things we'd like to do? So sometimes, when we look at things like the question answer pairs and triplets, how does that affect how we would harmonize across studies or use OMOP versus mapping the facts, which sort of incorporate into how a lot of the EHR and claims data is mapping? So I don't know the answers to these things, but there's just sort of things I wanted us to think about. Maybe this is a good problem space, because I think before, I know it's not directly vocabulary, Alexander, but I do think we need some of these in place then to figure out what are the vocabulary and CDM and Themis solutions that address these use cases. And as we kind of mix and match from the three areas and maybe others I haven't considered, are we getting too specialized? Can we come up with things that fit under the more general definition solutions that work with individual use cases or groups of use cases with a particular quality? So again, don't know the answers, but these are sort of my thoughts on our discussions of things that I think would be helpful to decide to help us move forward.
Nicole, can you say more about the triplets? So I get the question and answer piece.
Yeah, let me,
So
I have to
condition,
admit, I'm still kind of trying to understand it. Let me see. I had something pulled up here to take a look. Let's see. There's something, oh, okay. Okay, so I'm just going to read you a summary on it. And this is an AI summary, so I'm just going to read it because I also have kind of been trying to process this. So, handling complex triplet structures. The standardized guidelines must address complex question formats such as triplets, question plus condition procedure / intervention plus answer. The AI Ready group modeled this using a dual mapping approach, inserting the positive condition into the condition domain while also mapping the question answer combination and associated metadata into the observation domain. So that's why it's like a triplet, but also a dual mapping. So they're mapping into two tables. So one table, the condition, is having the positive condition response. So that would be the I have cancer or cancer, and then the rest of the information is mapped into the observation domain. So that's the question, has a clinician ever told you have cancer? And the answer, yes. So you're maintaining, it's similar to what you were saying before, Piper, about what are the three parts of the EAV. I don't know that this is a direct correspondent to the EAV, but I think this is what you're kind of looking for. So the answer is the condition, the fact basically of the condition is the commission domain, and then the question or answer combination goes into the observation domain. So everything is being mapped in two places, which is a little, whereas when we've talked about mapping facts, that would be in the condition domain or measurement or whatever. And when we talk about question, answer, and pairs, at least based on this example, that would be on the observation domain. So it's sort of like we have this option of, depending on what your use case is and what you want to do, we've got precedent for fact-based question answer pairs or the triplets, which are both the fact and the question answer pair. That's how I'm understanding it. Alexander or Michelle or Diane, if you have other thoughts about that understanding, feel free. Like I said, I've just been trying to understand it in summary from what Stephanie presented, and I admit to using AI to do that.
That was
Well,
how I got what I got out of it too, but
Yeah.
go ahead.
So I think that the triplets could be different, right? And this is a good definition, but the example that you mentioned is just one of the options, right?
Right.
And I think basically the triplet is when you have, let's say, two entities in the EAV model, but like combined together, right? So you could have the question and the answer and something else that would have an additional relationship to either a question or the answer. So something like that. And we saw different examples. I think that that would be really great if we can collect these examples, because sometimes you have, say, the list of predefined conditions, and you have some reference to this list, not like the value itself, but some additional reference, and then you take it from the list. So it could be structured really differently. But in general, the distinctive feature that you have more than just the question and the answer. You have more complex structure.
Yeah, and I deleted that because I'm going to clean that up. I think the way I had that written down was a little confusing. Right. And I think that's where we circle back into the use cases. You know, when you know, when do we care about which level of mapping? And then again, can we support that by our analytic goals? Because I think other than I've got my data in OMOP and maybe somebody else will eventually use it. It's a lot of work. I think we want to have distinct goals as to what our group, both the investment that comes from the working groups to come up with these standards and best practices, but also from the individuals doing the mapping. What am I getting out of mapping it, or what's my goal? And that kind of goes to analytic goals. I'm sure they're probably, again, these are not mutually exclusive, and there might be some other analytic goals. So what I kind of like to do, and obviously, Piper, you would be volunteered for psychometric. What I'd like to kind of do among like our group who's been presenting and things is to kind of ask for use cases, that consider these three things. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a grant proposal, but just something that would be, my survey is custom because it was created, through PIs, repurposing, other surveys and developing their own questions. I am interested in measuring facts because I just want to see if patient reported outcomes are concordant with what's reported in the EHR data. And my goal is to use OMOP tools to validate the harmonization, as well as allow the use of the survey data with EHR data. So that would be an example of a Connect-based use case. So something simple, but something that gives us a place to start. And then we can look at, does that use case fit our definition of a survey? And then what's needed from vocabulary to support that use case? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you want us to write out ones that we've come across? Is that the goal here?
Yeah, I don't think you need to look for something new. It's either a problem you've already handled or one you're in the middle of trying to handle. I think would probably be good. And it doesn't have to be, every survey you're working with. You can pick something as an example for a specific use case.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, we have a good one for ALS that we're working through right now. It's standardized, validated test with some facts, some question answer pairs, and we're using it to harmonize studies as well as hopefully in the future combined with some EHR data for analysis.
Great.
So
yeah, so you basically just did it. But I think that's really helpful. And then we can get, and I will confess these are AI summaries because I was running out of time. So I just wanted, so then I wanted Alexandra to circle back to how do these things fall into things that are needed from vocabulary. And so I think a lot of this can kind of be condensed to not having enough standard concepts to describe the types of data we're getting from surveys that are, different from what we see in claims and EHR data. And that kind of circles back to what is our process for promoting the custom concepts? And this is something where I feel like I need a lot of guidance from other work groups because I know vocabulary has a process for adapting. Vocabulary, the CDM has a process for modifications to the model. Themis has a process for adapting, best practices. And so, is there a fast track? Do we promote vocabulary concepts that have been mapped in community efforts, like the AI Ready project, or, all of us has a specific vocabulary, UK Biobank has a specific vocabulary. How do we decide what are our metrics or rubric for deciding what we need to add? What kind of speed do we move at? How is this affected by, how is vocabulary affected by what type of mapping we use? Piper?
Yeah, so, okay, a couple of thoughts. One, I think, can you go back to it's either on your first or your second slide?
Or the goal slide?
No. Yeah. So I think one thing, whoops, how do I lower my hand? There we go. Okay.
Sometimes it just
I think
comes down on its own. It takes a minute.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I think is really important is that there are existing standard terminologies, right? So I'm thinking now
right.
LOINC, SNOMED.
Yeah,
of course, CDISC has some, but I'm thinking LOINC and SNOMED. And for those types of, and I'm just going to call them instruments, right? So surveys are one type of instrument. For the types of instruments that are within scope for LOINC and for SNOMED, I feel pretty strongly that we need to, if we need things quickly, it's okay to add them to the OMOP extension, right? Where they're missing, because there's a time lag between when we get them into LOINC or SNOMED and then when the Odyssey vocabulary team can ingest them. But I think we have to do both in parallel. If we're looking at an instrument that belongs in both SNOMED and LOINC, we need to submit it to SNOMED, submit it to LOINC, and depending on where we are in the cycle, the release cycle for both OMOP and for each of those standards, we may need to also add it to the OMOP extension. However, depending on the timing, it might be more resource efficient to add it just to LOINC or SNOMED and then ingest that, okay? I can tell you already that a lot of the survey type instruments that are in like Biobank and All of Us and several of the NIH agencies in their CDEs for protocols are not within scope of either LOINC or SNOMED. So those would have to be necessarily handled within the OMOP extension unless LOINC or SNOMED would be willing to expand their scope of content. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a question or request. Do you think, because we talked about the triplet, and Alexander, you provided one example, and then Nicole, you talked about another example. Do you think for the Odyssey Symposium, we could get like one slide made with a graphic depicting, just so we can really clearly explain and people like me can really understand what we're referring to. And I can do that for the psychometric instruments. I have a couple slides. And then the other question is, we seem to, at least on the psychometric side, we have been talking about three things, which you've really already addressed. There's the content, right? What content are we using that currently doesn't exist, right? What survey instruments do we use a lot and they're just not, we don't have any concepts for them. So that's the content. And then of course, this group, we've been talking about the model, you know, how do we represent it in OMOP? And then we've been talking about, you know, the use cases. Do you know, so what the psychiatry working group has been working on is we've looked at the assessments that are used, right? So we know which ones are high priority.
Right.
So that's one first step, right? That doesn't address the modeling or use cases, but it, you know, do you guys know, do you have content prioritization from the surveys?
So
Yeah.
again, Alexander, I'm going to let you go ahead and chime in. It's sort of my short answer is we have, like, from things reported in the landscape assessment and discussions. Sorry, Alexander, I said that and then I decided to answer. Um, but I don't know what the high priorities are. Like, we know there's something, you know, we know there's going to be more frequency of use of standard validated surveys than there are these custom surveys made for cohort studies. But we also know that we ask a lot of overlapping questions. So I think the standard validated surveys are low-hanging fruit, and maybe we can look up some papers or reference information about the most used ones. But I also think it's possible if we could get into survey workgroup subgroups, we could also sort of have different focuses, whether it's on the subtype or the use case or something, so that we can develop some of this stuff in parallel. And yeah, so published is validated, like it's been reviewed for its content and it's widely used and it gets to a specific, you know, I think for the most part, when you talk about the underlying construct are things, yeah, that tend to be the standard and validated. All right, Alexander, sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, good. Well, I just wanted to respond to the first and the second one. So the first is how do we actually add the content to the Odyssey vocabularies, whether we do the OMOP extension or whether we contribute to LOINC and SNOMED and then wait for the next release cycle until it's added to the Odyssey vocabularies. So Piper, that is all fine. And like all the options are good, but this way you only solve the missing content problem, right? But like the scope of the problem we're trying to solve is a little bit bigger. And one of the issues is the redundancy duplication problem, right? By adding more and more content to the very same vocabularies, so eventually we have like the duplicates, right? So the same instruments or pretty much the same instruments or instruments with the different versions or whatever they are still standard and spread across multiple vocabularies, right? So this is like one of the problems we're still trying to solve. And another one is like, again, the model problem. So whether we want to have the questions and answers separately, how we're going to map them, do we want them pre-coordinated, do we want them whatever mapped with some new tables and all these sort of things. But in terms of filling the gap of the missing content, that is totally fine. And but I think Anna pushed back a bit in terms of we're not gonna add any new content unless we have a clear
Model.
conventions. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And the second one about the slides to show what the triplets are, and maybe that would also make sense to show what the pairs are, right? Because, well, there could be question and answer, there could be variable and value, and maybe some other things. So yeah, totally agree. We need to have these examples and like put them clear on the slide. So I can help with that. Probably I've seen a couple of examples, so I can collect them from the vocabularies. So yeah, let's do that.
Oh, that would be great, because one of the things I
Okay.
was gonna, yeah, because what I'd like to do is kind of put some slides together, you know, basically ready to share out among us at the end of the week, that can then be that problem definition we need to kick off the vocabulary. And then I am going to stop recording for a minute. if I can. Will let me. There we go. Okay.